So thanks a bunch for having me. I'm Scott Ford. I am the Chief Code Whisperer and CTO at Corgibytes. We're a software consultancy that focuses pretty much exclusively on legacy code, which I'll go into a little bit. But yeah, so thanks again for having me. And this talk is going to help you understand how communication is just as important as code. That's one of Corgibytes' core values, is that we need to treat our communication with just as much care and attention that we treat the code that we're touching. So this is me. This is and my partner, Andrea. She's my business partner and my life partner now. We went to high school together, and we became business partners after connecting at our 10-year high school reunion. And I look like the stereotypical software developer. I'm a white male. I have a beard. I wear glasses. I wear geeky T-shirts and hats. There are many versions of the stereotype that I fall cleanly into. Andrea, however, is not the stereotypical software developer. When we first started working together, Andrea was by far the better communicator of the two of us. Her undergraduate degree is in marketing and business law, and she had a lot of success working as a copywriter prior to coming on board with Corgibytes. And she dove headfirst into software development and really learned a lot. But these stereotypes that we both have, or kind of easily slip into, really caused a lot of challenges for us. Andrea was always asked if she codes. We would go to a meeting, we would go to a meetup, we would go to a conference, and we would meet people face to face, and people would talk to me and speak to me with all the technical jargon you might expect when speaking to someone who works with software. And then they would turn to Andrea, and the first thing they would ask is, do you code? And she got so frustrated with this question, and she got so frustrated with it coming up even in client meetings where she would do most of the talking and very technical discourse and technical conversation, and yet she would still get asked at the end of the meeting, oh wow, do you code? And so she decided that she would get a little snippet of JavaScript tattooed on her wrist, right where you could see it, where she would go to shake someone's hand back when we shook more hands, to try to demonstrate and show people, yes, I code. This is me, and I can be anything I want, and that's why this is tattooed here. And since she got that, she gets this question a lot less, because people look down and they see that snippet and they ask her less. So, but Andrea isn't the only one of us that has struggled with these stereotypes. I also struggle with this stereotype, because for most of my career, I was told that I wasn't a good communicator, like directly by managers, that I shouldn't be talking to customers. Like, if you've seen the movie Office Space, like this is a trope in that movie, that there is an individual on that team who is put in between the customers and the engineers because the company can't trust the engineers to talk to people. And I worked at organizations where that was the structure, and I was told that I wasn't allowed to talk to customers because I was too direct and I was too honest and I was too technical with them. And I couldn't be trusted because I would scare them and I would intimidate them and confuse them. But never did I get any coaching about how to get better. It was always just, you're bad, stop. And I really believed this. I let this idea that I shouldn't be talking to people like really seep into me. And when Andrea and I first started working together, communication was something that I avoided. I would ignore emails just flat out. I wouldn't write them. I wouldn't read them. And then when I did write them, I would keep them as short as possible, like just absolutely terse and brief, not really giving much care or consideration to the person who's on the reading end. And my goal was to be very efficient so I could get onto the things that I was good at. And I found myself like getting frustrated all the time if I had to repeat myself. If, the don't repeat yourself was an attitude and it's something that I aspired to in my code base. And so I was like, I'm going to use this in my written and verbal communication as well. So I shouldn't have to repeat myself all the time. And I would get really frustrated with this. And so Andrea continued to challenge me and continued to try to push me to really get better at these skills. I'm sorry, my slides aren't advancing. Give me a second. There we go. And she challenged me because she heard me talk about how proud I was to consider myself a polyglot developer. And if you've never heard of a polyglot developer before, this is a developer who is comfortable working in a multitude of programming languages. So they don't just identify as working with a single programming language. They are very comfortable working in multiple programming languages. And that's definitely me. I love being able to work in a production setting in a wide variety of languages. And I'm constantly looking for opportunities to even add more languages to my skill set. And so Andre really challenged me and said, there is another language that I can give just as much care and attention to. And this is a challenge that I would extend to all of you as well, to take this challenge on yourself. And that's whatever spoken language your team is using. I imagine for many of us here who are watching this, that that's English. A lot of the software development world works in English, but maybe your team doesn't. Maybe your team writes code in English, but you communicate with technical discourse in another language. And get really good at that language. Get just as good at that language as you would with the languages that you code with. Syntax, tone, clarity, cleanliness. These are all things that we often care about as software developers when we're thinking about our code. Those same things and those same issues come up when you're working with spoken and written language. And so get curious about the language that you're using to communicate with your team members, and think about how you can level up those skills and become a better communicator through the language that you're using to speak to your team. And so if you still, after all of that, are kind of thinking I've heard many people say this before, communication isn't really all that important. I'd like to try to convince you even further by explaining the impact that communication can have on a code base, and the impact that poor communication especially can have on a code base, and the improvements that can be seen when you do turn things around. So like I said earlier, Corgibytes, we specialize in taking older systems, neglected systems, applications and environments that we inherit from other people, and we like to turn those into modern, clean systems that look like they're brand new. They look like they are greenfield systems. And through our work doing this, we have noticed a theme over the years, and that's poor communication is at the root of most of the problems, most of the technical problems that we're facing. If we really dig a level deeper below the technical issue that we're struggling with, poor communication is the root cause of a lot of the problems that we're coping with. And there is a popular systems law that some of you may have heard of, and that's Conway's law. Conway's law is up on the screen. I won't read it, but it was developed by Mel Conway in the 1960s as a way to explain how there is this relationship between organizations and the communication systems that they create and the software systems that they end up creating. And it turns out that this applies to more than just software systems and more than just technical systems. This applies to informal systems as well. And this Conway's law is really why we end up with so many legacy rescue projects, so many projects that get into this state where people have just ready to give up on them. They've thrown their hands up in the air. They're asking for outside help because they don't know what to do next. And it's not because the technology is bad. It's gotten into a bad state. It's not because the developers were bad. They did the best they could in the situation that they had with the tools they had. But because the communication and the structures that supported the communication were incredibly poor, the software ended up being incredibly poor as a result. And so this is something that comes up often and is kind of at the undercurrent of why many systems end up in this state. But that's not the only pattern that shows up. There is another one that organizations struggle with as well. Another pattern that we've seen across the industry as we've been working, and that is that organizations frequently divide their team members across their organization into two buckets. They have technical team members and non-technical team members. They have technical people of the company, they have non-technical people of the company, they have technical departments, and they have non-technical departments. But here's the thing: when you're working on a software team, or you're working at a company that builds software and delivers software and ships software, you have to be both. Like, you can't be working in the sales department and not have an understanding of the technology, because you have to sell it. So you have to know it well enough to sell it. You have to know it well enough to explain it to others. That's a technical skill. You have an understanding of the technology. You are not likely going to dive in and independently fix bugs or add features to the system. So you don't have that degree of technical skill, but you do have some degree of technical skill. And to just label yourself as non-technical is not fair to yourself. And on the flip side, to only think of yourself as technical, if your primary job, if your primary role is fixing bugs and is adding new features, if you don't think about the other skills that you bring to bear, the other skills that are required for you to do your job, then those aspects of the work that you're creating can really be lacking. So you're not just technical and you're not just non-technical, you're both. So at Corgibytes, what we try really hard to do is to not even talk about this as a binary, more of as a spectrum. So there are people who are more technical than others, and there are people who are less technical than others. So think about where you fit on that spectrum. And, if you're talking to someone else, you can say, oh, I'm not as technical as you, right? And that's a way of acknowledging your distance and expertise and your distance and experience, while not completely discounting all of the expertise and experience that you have. And the same thing when you're talking to somebody else. I would often ask people, are you non-technical, when I was at a conference or at a meetup? Because when I would talk to folks and ask, whether or not it was I would ask that question because it was kind of like a shortcut for me finding out how technical I can be in my conversation. How deep can I get into the terms that I care about? How much understanding do you already have? And how detailed am I allowed to be with you? And so I would just kind of place it as a binary. But there are other ways to get that answer, and you don't have to just say, like, do you have absolutely no technical skill, which is really on the surface, like, that's the semantics of that meaning. And this like divide between technical and non-technical also shows up in another way, which is with degree envy. There are many software developers who have this idea that because they didn't go to university and get a computer science degree, that they can't be a good software engineer. They can't build and ship quality software. And that's not true. Some of the best software developers I've ever worked with had degrees in music or math or accounting or fine arts and graphic design. There are so many disciplines and so many fields that you can study as an undergraduate or even just in high school, and you can be an incredibly talented developer. You can ship really good quality software. You don't necessarily need a degree. And that's not to undervalue a degree. A degree in computer science can certainly teach you a lot. It can really enrich your experience and enrich your background, and can make it easier to solve certain kinds of problems. But it's not a baseline requirement. And there are people who don't have that degree who often look at the people who do, or even just look at the software team in general and assume that everyone there has that degree. And that's not necessarily true. The flip side also works. So you don't need to have a degree in English to talk to people. You don't need a degree in English or a degree in communications to give a presentation or to write a blog post or to write a quality commit message or to create variable names that are meaningful for other people. These are skills like any others, just like the more technical skills when your code base in terms of the language that you're using or the frameworks that you're using, those are just skills that you picked up along the way. You weren't born knowing them. You're not born knowing how to communicate either. They are skills that you can pick up along the way. And you do have to stretch yourself outside of your comfort zone. And as some have said, that is where the magic happens. When you are stretched outside of your comfort zone, that's when you really start to realize your true potential and learn exciting things that are interesting to you that you might not have never discovered before. So we've talked a lot about communication, but we really haven't chatted at all about what communication is or what it means. And so I'm gonna kind of put a pause in the conversation to make sure we have that foundational understanding and we're all kind of consistent on what communication is. And so I'm just going to go over that for a little bit. So communication really starts with empathy. You have to think about the person who's receiving the message that you're trying to send. Just like in an object-oriented system or even in a functional system, you have to give some consideration to what's receiving the communication message that you're trying to send. What is on the receiving end of that piece of information? If that is something that you need to consider and take into account when you're working on these systems. The same is true when you're communicating with someone else. What is that other person? Who are they? What do they need? So empathy can be thought of as a skill that you can develop. It's not something you're born with. It's not something that's just innate and that you're kind of blessed with at birth. It is taking and considering the perspective of someone else and trying to figure out what they need. And sometimes that someone else is actually your future self, which often happens in software systems. There have been many, many times that I've come across a block of code and wondered, what idiot wrote this? And they've run git blame and gone, oops, it was me. That happens more times than I'd like to admit. And so when you start to view communication as a tool for empathy and a tool for understanding other people's perspectives, then it can be really powerful, and it can be a really powerful way to shape your communication in terms of it being at the service of others. Sorry, struggling with my slides again. We can also group communication in terms of looking at a few different aspects of how it shows up. So on one way of looking at communication is in terms of when it happens. So there is synchronous communication that happens in the moment and asynchronous communication that happens later. An example of synchronous would be if you're watching this video live, then this is in a synchronous discussion. You're watching me speak as I speak it. If you happen to be watching a video recording of this after the fact, now this is an asynchronous discussion. You are interacting with me in an asynchronous way. Also in software, there's the obvious things and the less obvious things. And often the obvious is really easy to see, and the less obvious is very, very difficult to grasp. On the obvious end of the scale for communication on software teams, in the synchronous bucket, the top top left corner of the blue box, meetings, video calls, phone calls, those are things that you and the other participant have to both be present for in order for it to happen. On the asynchronous side, you've got email and documentation, text and Twitter and Slack messages and forums. And some of these happen on a spectrum, right? So some teams treat Slack or treat different channels in Slack as pseudo synchronous communication, even though it's an asynchronous platform. Some teams have established an expectation that while you're at work, you are reading and responding to messages in one or two particular channels. So they're treating that as synchronous, and perhaps the rest of the communication channels on that platform are being treated as asynchronous. So it definitely varies across systems and across infrastructures. And it is a little bit of a spectrum. It's not really a binary quite the way it's presented here. But things get a little more interesting when we start looking at the less obvious end. So when you're having a synchronous discussion with someone, there are things like eye contact and body language and how punctual you are. whether or not you show up on time can tell someone a lot about how much respect and how much attention you're giving and how much care you have. And because those are just kind of happening, they're just a matter of a matter and a byproduct of the way that we speak and the way we communicate. They often can get overlooked. But if you give some attention to them and start to notice how you show up in these ways, then that can be a way to level up your communication. On the asynchronous side, and then in the less obvious end of the spectrum, we have things like commit messages. So you might think like commit messages as communication, but yes, a commit message is a great opportunity to describe why something was done. And that message that you've attached will always be in the code. It will be in the source code repository attached to the lines that you've changed in a way that it can't be removed unless the history is deleted. Whereas other forms of communication can be pulled away from the code and can become out of sync with the code. A commit message will always stay in sync with the code that it applies to, so that makes it a really powerful tool for describing your rationale. And in case anybody does come across a line and like, why in the world was something written this way? They can go look and they can see your justification if you thought it was important enough to provide it. Naming is a form of communication. So the names that we give things, how clear we make the variables and the names in our system. If we just use single letter variable names for everything, regardless of the context, then that can be very confusing for people. If we use really long, complicated words to represent variables in a very common formula, where most of the people who are working in that domain use single letter variable names, then that could be equally confusing. So making sure you're picking the right naming strategy for the context that you're in. Also, the tests that you're writing and the way that you're testing and the way that you're writing down your tests in an automated or manual fashion, that's a form of communication. It's a way of documenting the behavior and the expected behavior of the system. And it's a way also of documenting what the team thought of. So if a bug comes up and all of your tests are passing, then that bug came up because it's something you didn't think of. Obviously, if you had thought of it, you would have written a test and the test would be passing and then you wouldn't have the bug. So it is a form of communication and a way of kind of communicating with the future and communicating with others about what your understanding of the system was at the time and what you considered important enough to write tests for. There are also pull requests, and this is very similar to a commit message, but if you're using a system that relies on pull requests or that's part of your team's practice, this is another great opportunity to describe the rationale for why something has been created, and then have a discussion about the merits of that approach in a threaded conversation with your other team members. Your timesheets are an opportunity to communicate. And that might seem silly. You might be on a product team where everyone just enters an 8 in their timesheet, or maybe that you don't have timesheets at all. But if you're working for a client in a consulting relationship, I can tell you, I have a lot of personal experience that clients find this incredibly valuable when you actually write down in your timesheet, not just the number of hours you worked, but a sense of what you were working on when you spent that time. This is a way of communicating what you did with those 6 hours or 8 hours or 3 hours that you spent on that project. And sometimes this comes up. Sometimes it's just because people are curious. Sometimes it's because they're angry and they want to know where their money went. So, that's an important way to communicate what you're doing. And last but not least, and probably one of the most important, is the error messages that are in your system. These communicate how things have gone wrong and what can be done to remediate and fix them, what the user can do in order to turn things around when they've encountered something that's unexpected. So the way that we define communication at Corgibytes, this is a definition that was very much shaped by Andrea, is that it's the artifact of your ideas. That's it. The communication is just the ideas that you have in your brain distilled into a concrete form. The ideas and knowledge that you have in your brain putting down into words in some format, whether it's words that you're speaking or gestures that you're making, the way that you're holding your body, it's your ideas put into a form and shared with the world. But that's not all that different than code, which is why we have this this mantra at Corgibytes, this core value that communication is just as important as code. So we talked about legacy code a little bit. One of the most popular definitions for legacy code is that it's code without tests. We've expanded upon that at Corgibytes. This is a definition that Andre has come up with, that legacy code is really just code without the proper communication artifacts to support its existence, of which tests are an important part. So it's really taking that Michael Feathers definition and expanding upon it and recognizing that tests are a communication artifact. They're a way of communicating. And if there are other communication artifacts that are also missing, then you can still have a legacy, still have a system that feels like a legacy system. And a way of thinking about this is that it's kind of like an archaeology environment, where if you go to a dig site and you're digging through the dirt and to learn about the civilization that was there before, all you have are the artifacts that they left behind. You have the crumbs of that civilization. And if you're drawing a comparison to a software system, then tests might be like bones, right? And they can tell you a whole lot about the people who live there. They can tell you how old they were. You learn what their genders were. You can learn what kind of injuries they encountered across their lifetimes. There's tons of things you can learn from bones. So they're a very important artifact. You can also learn a lot more by looking at other artifacts beyond bones. And the same is true with communication. Looking at multiple communication artifacts when trying to study an existing system is really important to give you a really kind of holistic picture of what that system was like. But you might be asking yourself, okay, why the heck does any of this matter? You've talked a lot about communication, but like, what does it matter for me and how does it apply to my career? So I'd like to go into that a little bit. And I think probably most importantly is that this will help you level up your career. The skills that you can apply and you can acquire by improving your communication will help you advance in your career. It will help you get that technical leadership position that you're hoping to get at your organization. It will help you become a manager one day if that's on your career path. It will help you be a senior architect one day if that's on your career path. It will help you start a business one day if that's something that you have a dream to do. Knowing how to communicate is really important for all of these roles. So leveling up is a big part of it. It can also help you build trust with the other team members. Trust is almost like a form of currency. And each time you perform an action that communicates to others that you're trustworthy, it's almost like you're like building a balance in a bank account, or in this case, a jar of marbles, which is a metaphor that Brene Brown uses a lot, and you can learn more about from studying her works. It can also help prevent forest fires or help prevent fires in your project. The metaphor of having to go around and put out fires on teams is one that's prevalent throughout the business world, and especially in the software world, where things come up, issues come up, 3 a.m. phone calls come up, and they're not fun. They're not fun to deal with. And really good, well-applied communication can help prevent these fires from happening. They're not going to prevent all of them. They're still going to come up from time to time. It can prevent a lot of them, though. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about patterns and frameworks that you can apply to your work to help you communicate better. Just similar to how we have patterns and frameworks on software systems, there are Python libraries that you like to reach for when you're working on a web project. Maybe you really like to maybe you like to reach for Flask, maybe you like to reach for Django. Whatever it is that you like to reach for, you have frameworks that you like using. And the same is true for communication. So I want to go over a few communication frameworks now. And if you're curious and interested, you can try to explore and find others later. Context switching is one of the first topic areas to look at. And context switching is a real struggle. And it came up a lot with me and Andrea when we started working together, because she would frequently ask me, hey, you got a second? And I would get incredibly angry because the mental model that I had built in my brain just evaporated. And it was very, very difficult for me to explain this and explain why I got so frustrated whenever she would just come up to me and say, hey, you got a second? And it was through a lot of curiosity on Andrea's part that we stumbled across a metaphor for what was going on in my brain. And it was almost as if I was within a dream, within a dream, within a dream, within a dream, like in the movie Inception. And when she said, hey, you got a second, all the dreams evaporated and they disappeared. And I did not know how long it was going to take me to get back there so that I could be productive and do my work. So we came up with this framework for communicating how deep into the work that you're working on is. Are you going really, really deep into technical focus and like you're like lasering in on a problem? Or are you getting like really, really vast in a strategic and kind of imagining focus, and you're kind of like expanding your awareness really, really big? In either case, it can be incredibly disruptive if someone tries to bring you right back to the present. So instead of asking, hey, do you got a second? We started asking, what's your inception level? And this gives us a way of understanding and communicating how interruptible somebody is. So now Andrea can come up to me and say, what's your inception level? And I can say, it's a 6. And she can go away and I'll know that she needs something from me. So when I get up to a 0 again, I can reach out to her, make sure that she's interruptible, and then see what she needed from me. So it's almost like a protocol for negotiating asynchronous communication without being disruptive. She can also come to me, find out that I'm at a 6, and say, I'm really sorry, I have to interrupt you, this is really important. But then she's aware of the cost and she can express some empathy for my situation. She knows how painful it's going to be. She knows how disruptive it is for me to context switch when I'm at such a high level of inception. So it's a great communication vehicle. The next kind of framework that we use at Corgibytes is called like the Shattering Glass syndrome, or the Shattering Glass framework. And this is inspired by a relatively old now television show, and How I Met Your Mother. And in that show, the character Ted, who's over here on the left, he would frequently say, well, actually, whenever someone would make a factual statement, he would try to clarify and refine what they said, which he thought was being helpful, but the other people who lived around him thought was disruptive and rude. So instead of, well, actually, when you hear something that needs to be expanded upon, and when you hear something that isn't 100% accurate, right, and you're trying to like encourage the person who made a statement to be more precise, instead take the wisdom of Tina Fey from her book Bossy Pants, where she talks about the rules of improvisation and just how important it is when you're in an improvisational environment, when you hear somebody say something, to not shut them down and not take their idea and say that's wrong. Instead, you find a way to build upon it by saying yes and. So be more like Tina and less like Ted. So when you find yourself wanting to say, well, actually, instead try to find a way to turn that into a yes and. So instead of saying, well, actually, it's best to use this library in that situation, you can say, yes, the library that you mentioned works. However, it's pretty painful to work with. There is an even better one, right? That builds upon what the person said instead of trying to shut it down. Feedback, giving and receiving feedback is a very important skill to pick up. It's especially hard to do so without being mean. And that's where a framework called Radical Candor comes into play. It was developed by Kim Scott. And she has a book, and the audiobook is fantastic. And she's got lots of other resources at her website, radicalcandor.com, that you can check out as well. But it talks about how to demonstrate that you care about the individual you're trying to give feedback to and challenge them directly. And when you do that, you're operating within radical candor. If you don't challenge them directly, or you don't demonstrate that you care about them, then you can fall into some of these other buckets, which are a lot less helpful and will not be as beneficial to either you or the person that you're trying to communicate with. Another really important thing to keep in mind with radical candor, something that will keep you, some rules that will help keep you within that boundary of the radical candor box, is to make sure that you're applying these rules as well to govern your behavior. Make sure that you're being humble, like don't try to be braggy or talk down to the person. And like, I'm better than you. This is why I know this, right? Like, oh, you need some candor, right? That's not the kind of feedback that you're looking to give. Instead, you're wanting to be helpful. Like, you're genuinely wanting to help the person. You're taking the time and the attention to make sure that they can get better. That's why you're giving them the feedback. You give them the feedback as immediately as possible after the thing that you noticed. So don't wait a week or a month or a year and tell them at their next performance review on January 1st of this year, you were very rude in a meeting. That's not going to be helpful. But if you tell them right after the meeting, hey, I'd like to let you know that the way you just behaved in there, you could have been better. Make sure that when you're delivering criticism, you always do so in private. When you're delivering praise, consider whether or not to do it publicly. Some people really enjoy public praise, some people don't. So try to take that into account. Generally, you can lean on the side of delivering praise publicly because it does signal to others that they can do better as well. And praise still makes some people feel uncomfortable. So keep that in mind. And then don't personalize the feedback you're getting. Don't say you're a poor communicator. Don't say you are rude. Instead, which I might have said it earlier, I might have said you were rude in that meeting. That would be a less awesome example. Instead, we say you were coming across as rude in that meeting, or even better than that would be the comments that you made landed as rude. The comments that you made were perceived as rude. And the difference there is that you're critiquing the communication artifact. You're not critiquing the individual, right? The individual can produce better communication artifacts later. The communication, the individual isn't a bad person. The individual produced a communication artifact that needs to be improved upon. So it's an important distinction there. So those are the patterns and frameworks that I have to cover. If there's nothing else that you walk away from this presentation with, I want you to walk away with the idea and like distilled down into you, like really, really deeply, that communication is a skill. It is a skill that you can learn. It is a skill that I've had to learn. It's a skill that I've had to level up at. I am still getting better at it. I don't like how many times I say when I'm giving a presentation. It's something that I'm working on. I don't like how rude I can be to people when I'm tired. It's something that I'm working on. There are many aspects of communication that you can adopt to level up and make even better. So this is something that you can learn. If you feel like it's too scary, you don't know where to start, hopefully this presentation has been helpful. I also want to leave you with the idea that I believe in you. Even if you don't believe in you, I believe in you. I know that you can do this. I know that this is a skill that you can adopt and that you can take on, and you can really make part of the way that you work and the way that you show up with other people in your team. And if you're curious about how to learn more, these are resources that I referenced or that help support the work that went into this presentation. I will make sure the slides are shared in case you're not able to take a screenshot fast enough. All of these resources are really, really helpful at helping you level up your communication. Some of them are written with technical audiences in mind, more technical audiences in mind, such as Present a Techie's Guide to Public Speaking. That is a fantastic work for like learning how to give presentations, if that's something that you might want to do one day. So it is something that you can level up on. If you'd like to get in touch with me and find out more about Corgibytes or or maybe continue the conversation if you didn't get a chance to ask a question here today, or to meet up with me later at the conference. These are ways that you can get in touch. In addition to legacycode.rocks, you can also check out a sister community that I forgot to put on the slide, which is Empathy in Tech. And that is a community that Andrea has been building to support the book that she's writing, which will be a great resource for everyone that I'll get to add to this presentation if I give it again after her book comes out. And her book is titled Empathy-Driven Software Development. And that is going to be a fantastic resource for helping people learn how to apply empathy and better communication skills to the software that they create. And so I'm really, really excited for that book to come out. I think it's scheduled to come out either later this year or earlier next year. So keep your eyes open for that. And if you'd like to make sure that you know when it's going to be available, then definitely head over to the Empathy in Tech community. You can find it at empathyintech.com.